Bueno, muchísimo gusto. Gracias por la introducción, Alejandra e Isidro. Es una pena para mí no poder estar ahí, pero estoy encantada de poder participar, aunque sea virtualmente. Entonces, lo que voy a hacer ahora es compartir pantalla y cambiar al inglés. Bueno, pienso que pueden ver bien la pantalla. Bueno, entonces mi contribución hoy viene de mi capítulo del Handbook Chapter de Familia y Economía, Family Economics and Economics, y es acerca de los nexos entre la cultura y la familia. Y como he dicho, hay muchas contribuciones, empezando con algunas de las mías, de que tienen más, ya deben tener como 15 años. Y lo que quería hacer yo hoy es dar lo que ha pasado en los últimos, dar ejemplos de investigación que se han hecho en los últimos 5 años, 4 o 5 años, que me parecen interesantes. Bueno, why should economists care about family and culture, or culture and family? Well, people are social animals. They live embedded in social fabrics and in social networks, and the family plays a central role in these networks. The family is really important to our understanding of economic outcomes, every economic outcome. Why? Because it's a fundamental unit that organizes economic activity. Furthermore, and here's the link with culture, it plays a key role in transmitting social beliefs. These beliefs matter to economic outcomes, and they affect development, welfare, inequality, you name it. The main message I want you to get from my talk today is that differences in family institutions, differences in cultural practices and social beliefs need to be taken into account to understand how economies functions and to formulate better policies. And as I said, much of what I discussed here, not everything, but much is summarized in my chapter with Natalie Bao in the Handbook of Family Economics, which I think came out a few months ago. Okay. So let me start with just some very basic definitions so that we're on the same page. What is a family? A family is the smallest, and here I'm using an anthropological view of the family, the smallest group of individuals who see themselves as connected to one another. They tend to reside together, they share economic opportunities and rights and responsibilities. The function of a family is to fulfill basic human needs, such as providing for children, defining parental roles, regulating sexuality, passing property and knowledge across generations. Culture, there's over, 200 definitions of culture. Here's one from the dictionary. It's the customary beliefs, social forms, and material traits of a racial, religious, or social group. And it's the integrated pattern of human knowledge, belief, and behavior that depends upon the capacity for learning and transmitting knowledge to succeeding generations. So here the focus is that there is some intergenerational aspect and that there are beliefs that matter. So for those of you who saw the large literature on institutions arise, again, several decades ago, you might want to be asking whether is family culture or is family an institution? I don't think that that's a very useful distinction. And what we do is we think of the family as a set of culturally transmitted norms. So the family is a set of norms that influence a broad range of social relations, and they organize interpersonal interactions, and they configure social networks in ways that profoundly influence social incentives and behavior. There's a great deal of variation in family institutions. This is both globally and over time. And these family institutions or cultural practices govern the form that's taken by social unions, such as marriage, what legitimizes these unions, who inherits, who supports parents in their old age, and who indeed is considered a family member. I'm just going to give you 2 quick maps. One of them shows you the variation that exists in ancestral, so not current, but ancestral family practices of current population groups. And this is patrilocality, which is the practice of going and living in your parents' house, in the parents' house of the man, or near the parents' house of the man upon marriage. And as you can see, this varies greatly across the world, with the darker colors being a greater percentage. And here is, for example, bride price. Again, this is how it varies across ancestral groups for current family populations. So what I will do next is to give you various examples of how the family matters. So the first example is going to be, it's actually two examples, the importance of kinship. I'm going to be looking at the importance of kinship both for conflict and for income in two recent papers. So here's a paper by Moscona, Nunn, and Robinson that looks at a segmentary lineage system. A segmentary lineage system traces the descent unilinearly, which means either through the father or through the mother, but not through both, say, as we do these days in Western economies, in which both your mother and your father define who your relatives are. So a unilineal descent can be either through the father, whereupon it's a patrilineal system, or through the mother, whereupon it's a matrilineal system. And a segmentary lineage system, aside from being unilineal descent, has segments of a full lineage function as autonomous groups. And these autonomous groups matter for political, judicial, and administrative functions. Now, anthropologists have hypothesized that segmentary lineage systems tend to lead to be more full of conflict than other systems. Why might that be the case? Well, here is an example of a lineage system in which you can think of each triangle as being parents, and then having, say, 4 kids, maybe 2 girls and 2 boys. If this was a matrilineal system, then this would be the 2 girls, and each one of them then traces the hereditary through her own descendants, and these form independent subsets. So this is a child, another child, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So suppose that individual 1 over here at the bottom were to enter into a conflict with individual 9 over here. Then in a segmentary system, if this conflict were to exist between 1 and 9, then everyone all the way up to the major segment in A would be recruited in the conflict against everyone in the major segment in B. And as you can kind of think or intuit, you might think that conflicts would be larger because many more individuals are brought in. It does not stay between individual 1 and 9, and therefore they may also be longer. So this is what the hypothesis that anthropologists had hypothesized before, and this is studied by the authors in the context of ethnic groups in Africa that come from groups which have segmentary lineage, which are these dark ones. The light ones are non-segmentary lineage, and then the white ones are ethnic groups that are outside the sample. Here, although it's hard to make out, those little dots are showing you conflict incidents, both in non-segmentary and in segmentary ethnic groups. What the authors did was to study the relationship, first correlationally, between being part of a segmentary lineage, ethnic groups, and the amount of conflict that exists. So each one of these names that you see here is one of these ethnic groups. And this is the segmentary, what's being plotted here is segmentary lineage, conditional on country fixed effects, some geographic fixed effects, and also some historical controls, such as the level of pre-industrial economic development that existed, an indicator for whether the group is patrilineal or matrilineal, etc. And what I'm showing you in these four graphs here is different types of conflicts. So A is all conflicts, B is civil conflicts, C is non-civil conflicts, and D is intergroup conflicts. And as you can see, there's a relationship, a positive relationship between belonging to a segmentary lineage system and deadly and the amount of deadly conflicts that exist. Now, this is a correlation and not causality. So to look at causality, what the authors do is to use a boundary discontinuity approach. So in dark here, as an example, you have a segmentary lineage ethnic group, and in light bordering it, you have a non-segmentary lineage group. And the question is, how does the amount of conflict change as we go from lighter color to the dark, that is from the non-lineal to the lineal familial group, ethnic group, sorry. How does the amount of conflict change as we get closer to the border? And here you can see the bin scatter plot showing you at the distance to the border. And at 0 is the border between these two ethnic groups. And then as you go towards the right, you're getting further away to the border and more into the interior of the segmentary lineage society. And as you can see, there's an important discontinuity that happens as we get to the border of this group. So that was it in terms of causality. So here's an example then overall of how the family is organized and who is considered a relative, who is considered an alliance might matter to something as like conflict. Now I'd like to turn to cousin marriage. Cousin marriage is a measure, it can be taken as a measure of kinship, of kinship and kinship intensity in particular. And what I have here is just to motivate is simply the percentage of marriages between first or second cousins in log scale on the x-axis. And here on the y-axis, we have GDP per capita, once again on the log scale measured in the year 2000. And as you can see, there is a relationship that's negative between the percent of marriages that are between first or second cousins and GDP per capita. Now, we're not going to be addressing the causality of this, but what we're going to do is look at a particular instance of historical cousin marriage. And I'll turn to that in a second. But before I do, why might we think that the degree of cousin marriage might matter? Well, a hypothesis that's been put forward is that it's in a society that's modernizing, sorry, I'm a bit sick, society that's modernizing and becoming more urban and less agriculture, the intensity of kinship ties tends to make mobility less possible. You have reasons to be staying, you're part of a network, you need reasons to be staying on the farm, let's put it that way. And there might be very good things that come with cousin marriage and having a very close kinship system, but it might, when a country is developing, it might produce some impediments to modernization. So this is what was studied in a recent paper that's forthcoming, I think, next month by Gosh, Huang, and Squires. And what they do, which I think is a really very nice idea, is they look at cousin marriage bans in the United States. So cousin marriage used to be fairly, acceptable. And then because of a variety of reasons, and I don't have time to discuss them right now, there started being bans on marriage and cousins, particularly in the United States. So it started with Kansas in 1858, then 8 states in the 60s, 2 in the 70s, et cetera, et cetera. The variation in timing, the authors argue, is due to states entering the Union and to idiosyncratic activism, so non-causal. They want to ask what importance did cousin marriages have for various measures that might be related to development. Now, the problem is there is no direct measure of the number of cousin marriages. So what the authors do is to construct one using US marriage records from 1750 to 1940. And what they do is they calculate the excess frequency of marriages that occur between individuals with the same surname. So take my surname and pretend we're in Argentina. Fernández is very common. So there's going to be a lot of marriages among Fernándezes, even though we're not cousins. And that might happen. What you're interested in is the excess frequency that can occur between individuals with the same surname. So that part that comes beyond the fraction of the population that has that surname. So what they do is they classify surnames into high cousin marriage if prior to 1858, so between 1750 and 1858, you had an excess frequency of above 10%. Okay, and then they are thinking of marriage and where it's occurring as being defined by the state that you lived in and the decade that you were born. And what they do is to study outcomes for men who were born in the same state and in the same decade, who have high cousin marriage surnames relative to similar men, that is, men born in the same state and the same decade, but have low cousin marriage surnames. Everybody's a low cousin marriage surname unless they reach that 10% threshold measured in 1750 to 1858. So they're running this equation where Y is going to be an outcome. Alpha ST is a state cross-decade fixed effect. Alpha SH is a state cross high cousin marriage surname fixed effect. Alpha C is a census fixed effect. And then they're going to be looking at 6 decades before and 6 decades after the state instituted this ban on cousin marriage and see how important it is. So when we do this, they're going to be taking the year -1 to be the year of the cousin ban instituted by the state. And what they're doing, therefore, is an event study. So the first thing is, does it matter? So cohort 0 here was born 1 decade after the cousin ban was instituted. And as you can see for that cohort, already you start having smaller percentages of cousin marriages, relative, again, always to men born in the same state in the same decade. And the relative is high cousin marriage surnames relative to low cousin marriage surnames. Okay, and so you can see there was basically no movement in the decades prior, and then it decreases. So this ban has an effect on cousin marriages. Cousin marriages for those men is affected. I should say you only study men here because women always change their surnames once upon marriage, and we're only starting white men since there's a history of Black men changing their surnames during this time period. So now let's look at some outcomes. The outcomes that they look at here have to do with various degrees of urbanization and mobility. So here I'd like you to think of, this is how populated where they're living is. And as you can see, there's an increase a few birth decades later in the amount, how populated the area that they're living is, okay? But remember that by population, this is not a general movement in the population. This is a population, this is where these men with high cousin marriage surnames reside relative to those with low cousin marriage surnames relative to decades before. So relative to time -1, sorry. And the next is how likely they are to live in a farm, and you can see that that goes down. The next is how likely they are to live in an urban setting, so not just not in a farm, but also not in a town, but actually in an urban setting? And lastly, is how likely are they to be living in a state that is not their state of birth? And you can see by in all four measures, there's an increase for high cousin surname names relative to low cousin surname names, showing that there is geographic mobility upon once the span is instituted a few decades later for cohorts born a few decades later. Now, the most interesting part in some sense is to ask whether this has any effect on income. And I won't go into the details of how income is measured here. Let me just say that it's measured using income percentiles, where the income percentiles change every decade, and they have to do with the status of the occupation by looking at the median income of that occupation. And once again, you can see that these men, if anything, used to be poorer. And once the cousin ban is instituted a few decades, for the cohorts born a few decades later, we see an increase in their income. So I thought this is a really nice proof about how family culture in here, the culture was marrying your cousin, how when it is forced to change because of the ban, you see economic effects that are quite important. Okay, I'm now going to turn to thinking about a few other some important parts of the family, which are family's culture, beliefs, and practices. And I am going to talk about a particular paper, now in a different context, which is how son preference, dowry, and gold price shocks might interact to give certain outcomes that we would consider rather negative. So first of all, historically, dowry was primarily a bequest of parental property to the bride. Dowry, upon marriage, okay, dowry has disappeared in most of the world, but it persists in contemporary India, despite being prohibited since 1961. And it's becoming more common in Bangladesh, in Pakistan, and Sri Lanka. Nowadays, dowries are often appropriated by the groom and by his family. Now, in India, which is the case that we're going to be looking at, dowries are large. They're often 4 to 8 times annual household income. And gold is an important component of them. 70 to 90% of households give dowry, and 95% of these households who give dowry report giving in gold. The other way they also give is with silver. When a child is born, and if that child is a girl, families start to save immediately upon the birth of the girl for this dowry, given how large it is. Now, what Balotra and her co-authors, I should say Balotra, Chakravarti, and Guleshi do, is they study the negative effects of having a dowry tradition with gold prices increasing, when gold is such an important part of dowries. And the main idea is that an increase in the price of gold makes daughters more expensive. It also makes sons perhaps less expensive. They're going to be bringing in the dowry of the girl that they marry. And this could potentially lead parents to want to have fewer girls. Now, for this statement to be true, for the price of gold making a dowry more expensive, it requires the amount of gold and of silver not to adjust completely when the price of gold changes. That if it doesn't adjust completely, or if it doesn't adjust too much, then you're going to have the dowry value go up. Now, the authors provide that there evidence that there's rather little adjustment. And in fact, the pass-through is such that the dowry values increases by 80% of the percentage price increase of gold. So 80% gets passed on. Now, the price of gold is not determined in India. It's determined in a world market. It's highly variable, and it follows a random walk. And what the authors do is to study the outcomes of the second-born child. Why the second-born child instead of the first-born child? Well, it's because there's some evidence that actually families like to have a girl. She's very useful. She helps with the household, etc. So you don't want to study what happens when they have one girl, but rather what happens when the second child is a girl. They do not necessarily want 2 girls. Why not study families that are larger? Look at the 4th or 5th. And again, one might be worried about there being greater selection into unobservable family characteristics when families are larger. The authors differentiate across 2 periods, 1972 to 1985 and 1985 to 2005. Why this differentiation? It's because as of 1985, then you have ultrasound, which is going to allow prenatal sex selection. So what do they see? Well, they look at what happens to neonatal mortality for girls relative to boys once you see an increase in the price of gold in the first month of birth of that girl. So this is the second child. They're controlling for a bunch of covariates, caste of the family, price of oil, the price of rice, rainfall, their state, year, and birth month, fixed effects. The sex of the child is also a fixed effect, etc. What they show is that in the pre-ultrasound period, when you see an increase in the price of gold in the first month of birth, you have higher neonatal mortality for girls. That is, girls are much more likely to die when they're 2, 3, 4, 5 months, years old. This does not necessarily mean that the parents are actively killing them. It can be simply neglect. In other words, if the child is sick, they do not buy medicine for the child. They do not go to a doctor for the child, or they do not share scarce resources of food as generously for a girl. In the post-ultrasound period, they don't find any effect on neonatal mortality. But what they find instead is a lower probability of a newborn being a girl. That is, the sex ratio becomes much more skewed towards boys, showing that there's selective abortion going on, which I think is now a well-known fact. Okay, so this has always been a well-known fact, but here it's what's interesting in this paper is showing that an increase in the price of gold, I think here it's in the first and second trimester, is going to be associated with fewer girls being born in the population because they're aborted. They also show further evidence regarding the mechanism. They differentiate between those families with a firstborn boy relative to a firstborn girl, and they show that the results are driven by those with a firstborn girl. So it's the second girl that's being either aborted or not treated as well as a boy. They differentiate between Hindu households and those of other religions, in particular Muslims and Christians. Both Muslim and Christians have far weaker traditions of dowry, and that they show that the results are driven by the Hindu households. And furthermore, they show that looking at the pre-1985 data, so pre-ultrasound, and looking at individuals who are between the ages of 15 and 50 during this period, they show that higher gold prices averaged throughout the birth year is associated with women, but not men, being shorter. So they've been given less nutrition, even though these women are positively selected. So even though these women might have not gotten much food in the first year of birth, and so you would think there's some positive selection going on because they're survived, they still come out being shorter, showing the effect of neglect occasioned by this gold price shock. Okay, now I'd like to talk about policy and cultural change and how these might matter. So here I'm going to be talking mostly about cultural change. And what I want you to understand is that culture is not static, nor are beliefs in a society uniformly held. And so one question you might have is, what changes culture? What changes the culture of a society? What changes the culture of a family? As economists, we like to say everything responds to shock. That way we don't have endogeneity. That's always questionable. But still, you can think of technology and environment, policy, knowledge, changing society, and then society responding to the changes in incentives. It can also change because there's a change in the ability to monitor and punish transgressors against the society, against social beliefs. And it can also get stuck, though, especially if changing requires some degree of coordination, or it creates losers and winners. Think about change towards the position of women in society. It might be a win-win, but for some people, it might not be a win-win. They may lose their status if women gain greater opportunities. So here I looked at two papers, and the first one has to do with pension policy, and this is a paper by my co-author on this chapter, Natalie Bao, from 2021. And what she does is to study the effect of the introduction of a pension plan in Indonesia. Now, Indonesia has both matrilocal and neolocal ethnic groups. Matrilocal means that upon marriage, the bride and groom go and live in or near the household of the bride's parents. Neolocal means that they locate somewhere different altogether. And in Ghana, you have patrilocal, meaning they go to live with or near the parents of the groom, the man's parents, and also neolocal ethnic groups. So they're quite different. One is matrilocal, in Indonesia is matrilocal and neolocal. Ghana is patrilocal and neolocal. Now, why do these practices exist? And I mean, a longstanding hypothesis in economics is that these practices substitute for missing markets, okay? So, you know, if there is no way to take care of parents when they get older, then what matrilocal and patrilocal practices do is they provide parents with care in their old age. And by doing that, it also gives parents an additional incentive beyond altruism, beyond caring about their kids, to invest in the human capital of their kids. Why? Because they're going to get some of those returns because the children are going to come and live with them and help support them. So any returns that come through the marriage market or through the labor market are going to be helpful to the parents, to the wife's parents in a matrilocal system, to the husband's parents in a patrilocal system. There's a great deal of variation of the importance of these groups for Indonesia, for the share matrilocal. As you can see, darker colors, it means a greater percentage of that population in that province or district is practicing, comes from a patrilocal ethnic group. And in Ghana, the same, an equivalent graph is showing you in darker colors the share of the population of that area that comes from a patrilocal ethnic group. So the first thing that they show is that in Indonesia, looking at within the same household, daughters relative to sons are more likely to be enrolled in school in matrilocal ethnic groups than daughters versus sons from neolocal ethnic groups. So this is within households, what happens to the education gap. In Ghana, the opposite is true. Sons relative to daughters in the same household are more likely to be enrolled in school in patrilocal ethnic groups than sons versus daughters from neolocal ethnic groups. Now, the interesting question here is what happens when a pension plan is introduced? And the main idea is that what a pension plan does is to reduce the dependency of parents on their children. But by doing so, this might affect the incentives of parents to invest in their children. So they exploit both cohort variation, daughters who would have been too old to receive more education. They also exploit different intensity of treatment, how the pension plan was rolled out across districts. So there's a triple diff here. And they find that for Indonesia, within the same household, again, this controls for any household fixed effects because you're looking at the household. Women's education fell in matrilocal relative to neolocal ethnic groups. So you see, parents are investing less. There's no differential effect on males' education by ethnic group practices, so only girls are affected. Furthermore, so now we see an effect on education. Furthermore, the pension plan itself affected culture. The practice of matrilocality decreased more for those cohorts that were treated more intensely. So you see an actual change in what kind of family is considered socially right in the sense that matrilocality falls. In Ghana, you get very similar results, but for men. So for men, you find that men's education decreased, as did the practice of patriarchal. Okay, and so now I'm going to talk a bit about a particular paper of mine with also Sahar Parsa and Martina Vierengo, which looks at the potential introduction of a new type of family, a same-sex family. And I don't look at family formation per se, although obviously it has consequences for it, but rather how people feel about the morality of same-sex relationships. So here's a question that's being asked in the General Social Survey since it was instituted in 1973. And it asks, is it wrong for same-sex adults to have sexual relations? And as you can see from this graph, where on the y-axis, I'm looking at the share who approves of same-sex relationship. This is very low, about 20, in the low 20%, all the way until you get till 1991. And then between 1991 and 1993, you see a very large discrete jump. And then the evolution of this thereafter as something that we're living through today. And I should say this is in the context of the United States. What do I mean to approve of same-sex relationships? It means that you answer either it's never wrong for same-sex adults to have sexual relation, or it's sometimes wrong, as opposed to saying it's always wrong or almost always wrong, okay? So you see, this has been cultural change that we've seen in our lifetime that's been fairly radical. Now, why do we see approval of same-sex relationships jump in 1992-93? 1981, so a whole decade later, is the beginning of the AIDS epidemic. As you can imagine, AIDS did not increase the approval of same-sex relationships, if anything, on the contrary. But what it was a shock that organized gay individuals behind a common cause. Suddenly, whether you were a relatively well-off gay person or a relatively poor gay person, who maybe disagreed on what kind of taxes you want, now the overwhelming priority became finding a cure for AIDS. That is what united the gay community. This organization and the political sophistication of this group, there's PACs that are political action committees that are created, there's a lot of lobbying, mobilization. This makes them a potent political group that's ready to be courted. And it is at the national level, first at the local, but then at the national level, in the 1992 presidential election. And for those of you who were not around then, that was the original George Bush, so Father Bush, versus Bill Clinton. And in that election, the Republican and Democratic parties, in their national platforms, took explicitly opposing stands about gay people serving openly in the military. This gave rise to a very public debate and lots of sustained public attention was given to this issue and to gay people in general, while this was debated in Congress for an entire year, for all of 1993 till November, and Clinton obviously becomes president in January of 1993. Here I'm just showing you a little bit of what I mean by unprecedented levels of attention. Just don't bother with all these points. Let's look at the blue graph, which is showing you by searching for key words that are associated with being gay, but not to do with AIDS or anything necessarily like that. It's showing you the number of gay and lesbian, what we call gay and lesbian related stories, where on the evening news, which in the United States was ABC, CBS, NBC during this time period. So for those of you who are very young, you don't remember that before, where we used to get our news was from watching the evening news. It was a half-hour program, and you watched on one of these major channels, and that's how you got your news. You didn't have the social media. So you can see there's a spike in first a large increase in 1992, and then in 1993, and this is the year where it's being debated, should gays serve openly in the military. So very large increase in attention. That's not matched by anything that happened previously. We can also look at newspaper articles. These are the same 59 newspapers that we can find from 1987 all the way till I think it's 2002. And you see a large spark of newspaper articles in which gay-related words, the keywords that we're searching for, are mentioned in 1993. And then it never comes close to that again. So there's definitely been an increase in media attention in 1992, 93. And what I guess what I want to say next is what we see in 1990, let me just take you back. What we see in 1992, 93 is something discrete going on, some large change. One could ask, isn't there a change going on in other attitudes? Maybe there's something going on in the economy or in the cultural sphere that's leading to changes in attitudes more generally. So you can do a rigorous test for whether there is, it's the Wald Supremum test, for whether there is a single break in this year's, and search for an unknown break point in a year. Only the red, which is the approval of same-sex relationships, shows that break. Everything else, and here I'm just showing you a few things, extramarital sex, approval of a woman staying at home, premarital sex, pornography law, abortion, capital punishment on the right, having a Black president, having a female president, whether gun laws should be more restrictive, interracial marriage, everything else, it's evolving over time, but there is no break coming around this period. And you can show that rigorously. So there's something that's happening in this particular sphere rather than in the sphere of sexuality or liberalism more generally that's giving rise to this. What we do is we hypothesize that the public debate and the far greater salience of gay-related issues let people to reconsider their positions about how much they approve of gay individuals. And this initiated a process of cultural change and diffusion of different values over time. Now, this is a statement that takes place over time, so it's very hard to test that way. And instead, we need to have heterogeneity or variation coming from somewhere. The variation that we use is we argue that individuals that come from places, be it states, be it counties, with greater exposure to gay individuals, and therefore to higher levels of mobilization, they're more likely to have gay friends and acquaintances. The local news is more likely to be affected by the national debate. These people, either because of salience or because of contract theory, they're more likely to have a friend who is gay and now know that their friend is gay. These people are going to be more exposed to the gay community, and they're going to be more likely to increase their approval. Now, it's not easy to measure how many gay people there are in a population, as you can imagine, particularly in the 1990s. We measure it two ways. We use the cumulative AIDS rate in the state population in 1992. At this point, AIDS has been around for a decade. So that's what a variable we call the cumulative AIDS rate in 92. Or the 1990 census, which for the first time asked if you had a partner at home who was an unmarried partner. Marriage among individuals of the same sex is not legal at this point. And so if you answered, and then you can code whether this partner is of the same sex or of a different sex. And we do this both at the state level or across counties within a state. And this is our variable called gay pop. Just so that you have a feel for the literature, and I'm about to finish, not the literature, sorry, the findings, how the raw data behaves. This is how the raw data approval evolves in high AIDS states relative to low AIDS states during these periods. As you can see, approval jumps both in low and in high, but in the raw data, it jumps more in high than in low raw. And here's the same thing for the gay population, for gay pop. Now, what we do is we show that individuals, we look at approval as an outcome. We have state fixed effects, we have time fixed effects, we have a whole host of individual level characteristics such as age, sex, race, education, household income, categories for the size of the city of town of residence. And each one of these are interacted with D, which is a decade, a different decade, the 70s, 80s, and 90s. And our particular question is, if you come from a group, a DIGT, tau, a group, a state that belongs to the high AIDS category in a particular decade, say in the 90s, do these people change their approval by more than the people who live in the low AIDS state in the 90s? And of course, all this, this is a diff and diff, all this relative to the 19s, the gap that already existed in the 1970s. And what we find is that living in a high AIDS state is associated with an additional increase of 5.5 percentage points in the 90s, relative to living in a low AIDS state, and relative, of course, to the gap that already existed in the 70s. Similarly, living in a high gay population state is associated with an additional 7.7 percentage points in the 1990s, relative to low gay population state, and again, relative to the difference that already existed, as you saw, in the 1970s. And we see this as an example of how incentives for people to come out, mobilize, or organize ultimately led to cultural change once the political establishment, here at the Democratic Party, has incentives to embrace them and to destigmatize talking about these individuals in the population. So let me conclude. I think I'm basically over time. Social beliefs and family cultural traditions can matter tremendously to economic outcome. The work I've done in the past looked at women's labor force participation, but there's also gender segregation and occupational choice, the amount of time that they spend with children, a whole host of outcomes. Now, the importance of culture and the family's essential role is often overlooked in economics. And hopefully this is something that will be remedied even more over time. But an important message that I want to leave you with, which is, I hope, clear from the last two examples I gave, is that culture is not destiny. Beliefs can change, and often radically, in response to other changes in the economy. And that policy needs to take culture into account in order to be effective, and in order not to come out with negative results, as we saw in the example of Ghana and Indonesia, without becoming a slave to culture. Okay, thank you very much. And I guess I'm now open for questions.
Bueno, muchas gracias, Raquel, por tu presentación. Ahora estamos abiertos a preguntas del público. Yo aprovecho este espacio para hacer una pregunta que me queda resonando después de tu participación. Es realmente indudable el efecto que tiene la cultura en la potencial efectividad de una política de intervención, y a la vez las intervenciones van a afectar a la cultura. Y entonces, ¿cómo medir de una forma robusta la cultura, de modo que podamos atacar esta posible doble causalidad que tendríamos que mirar al entender estas interrelaciones?
Pienso que de la misma manera que medimos todo en economía, es decir, siempre buscamos algo que es plausiblemente exógeno. Entonces, por ejemplo, en el paper mío, la SIDA era una enfermedad. Obviamente es endógena a la actividad sexual de los individuos, pero que haya aparecido cuando apareció es exógeno. Entonces, después me parece que es cuestión de, la SIDA no es la cultura, pero es una manera de decir, bueno, viene un cambio y que va a afectar diferencialmente a la gente. Es decir, como cualquier otra cosa, me parece que tenéis que poder hacer un argumento, y no es un problema de medición, sino es un problema de endogeneidad. Tenéis que poder hablar de qué es exógeno y qué es endógeno.
Bueno, muchas gracias. Y ahora, por favor, adelante las personas que tengan preguntas. No, está apagado.
Ya, perdón. Tengo una pregunta. Después de, por ejemplo, leer el libro de Evolving Ourselves, En un capítulo hablan de las aceptaciones culturales después de las guerras. Por ejemplo, después de la Segunda Guerra Mundial y con Franco, se les decía a las niñas que 1 de cada 10 se iba a casar y las demás tenían que ser las amantes, ¿no? Entonces, socialmente aceptable, así se formaban las familias. Después, también con las guerras islámicas, se decía que para expandir la religión, pues los hombres de esa religión se podían casar con más mujeres, ¿no? Entonces empezaron y lo aportaron 4 mujeres por cada hombre. No sé si en los estudios hay estas definiciones institucionales de familias donde se diga, por eso la cultura así se perpetúa. Y, por ejemplo, en el caso del Islam, pues las reprimidas siempre son las mujeres, ¿no? Y eso como una política pública puede ayudar en contra de algo que ya está religiosamente aceptable. Es una pregunta. Gracias.
Sí, no sé si capté totalmente cuál es la parte que es una pregunta, pero yo diría que no es algo de Islam, sino que diría que la religión católica y todas las religiones que yo conozca han tenido a la mujer en un plano secundario. Entonces, no nos podemos guiar simplemente los últimos 50 años. Tendríamos que mirar antes de los primeros 50, de estos últimos 50 años para ver que la mujer siempre ha estado en una posición secundaria, así, en la historia. Ahora, ¿por qué es eso? Y tiene que ver con que los hombres tienen más fuerza física y eso es lo que importaba en ese momento, etcétera. Me parece que no se han contestado. Pero sí, las religiones también, por varios shocks que tienen, como lo que dijiste tú ahora, puede ser que siga aún más fuerte esa tradición de tener a la mujer en una posición secundaria. Ahora, ¿por qué no cambia eso? Es porque yo pienso que es porque ideológicamente conviene no cambiarlo, porque parte de la autoridad de esa ideología o de esa religión viene de esas creencias. Pero en el mundo islámico antes había, por lo menos, y pienso que en algunas partes todavía hay muchas opiniones diferentes acerca de qué es lo que dice la religión acerca del rol de la mujer, también en la religión católica. Entonces no estoy segura si te contesté a la pregunta, pero intenté.
Sí, perdón, es que se apaga el micrófono. Sí, muchas gracias. Era sobre todo de cómo hacer la definición institucional de esas familias, ¿no? Porque aquí en la definición institucional de un papá, una mamá con los hijos, por ejemplo, ya sea sectarian o no sectarian cultures, en estas religiones, ¿cómo se harían, verdad? Porque está father and 4 wives, and then the children
No, esto es una familia. ¿No? Es decir, hay más que un modelo. El modelo que se perpetuó empezó un poco con la Iglesia Católica en 1100, que prohibió que la gente se case con sus primos o con cualquier persona de la familia bastante grande, y también hizo que promulgó que la gente tendría que no vivir en las casas con sus padres, tendrían que vivir independientemente. Sí, hay toda una historia de cómo es que surgió lo que hoy conocemos como la familia nuclear. Pero la familia nuclear no era la manera obvia de organizarse. Es una manera que surge recién como, no sé, yo diría los años 500, no sé. Pero hay muchas maneras de organizar la familia. Y esa tradición importa.
Gracias, muchas gracias.
Sí. Perdón, no sé si no se escucha al menos que tengan el micrófono, así que no.
Bueno,
Sí,
sí me escuchas.
sí.
Muchísimas gracias, Raquel, por la plática. Yo creo que fueron muchos resultados muy interesantes y como que más que una pregunta, se me ocurre hacer como una reflexión de cómo tiene que haber como una cercanía muy grande entre la antropología y entender qué es lo que sucede adentro de cada cultura y cómo se dan las relaciones intrafamiliares para poder modelar y entender cuáles van a ser los efectos de políticas públicas, ¿no? Entonces, esto como que es a lo que lleva tu plática, ¿no? A que pues la economía tiene que estar muy cercana a otras ciencias sociales que permitan entender el rol de los diferentes miembros de las familias y su participación en la economía, ¿no? Cómo esto afecta a la economía y como que no hay una receta única, sino que pues va a haber muchas etnias, muchas culturas diferentes que hay que entender cómo funcionan.
Sí, estoy de acuerdo contigo, pero tampoco quiero exagerar la importancia de antropología para esto. Es decir, la familia, el rol que tiene la mujer y lo que se cree en la sociedad occidental, que es el rol de la mujer, ha estado cambiando durante los últimos 100 años. Y no necesitas ser antropóloga, puedes vivir en una familia hoy en día en un país como México o como la Argentina, como Estados Unidos, y ver qué roles se consideran más aptos para las mujeres. Ahora, todo eso está en flujo, todo eso está cambiando. Pero lo que no quiero hacer es un poco exagerar que hay que estudiar sociedades antropológicamente muy distintas que las nuestras o del mundo desarrollado de Occidente. No es solo eso, también en nuestras sociedades. Si yo miro a las creencias en Colombia acerca del rol de la mujer, son bastante distintas que las creencias que tienen en Dinamarca, o en Estados Unidos, o en Argentina. Son bastante machistas los colombianos. Son diferencias de creencias que después dan lugar a una división de trabajo dentro de la familia y por lo tanto fuera en el mercado laboral. Entonces, sí, pero algunas cosas me parece antropología, y digo varios ejemplos aquí. Antropología es súper útil para ver la importancia enorme de la familia. Pero también tenemos bien cerca de casa muchos ejemplos de cómo las creencias culturales de una familia importan. ¿Por qué? Porque se transmiten intergeneracionalmente y también regulan cómo se hacen las cosas dentro de la casa y fuera de la casa.
Exacto. Bueno, muchas gracias.
Ya.
Sí, Raquel, gracias por la presentación, Isidro. Tengo dos reflexiones. Una, el tema de los primos. Es como un extremo de la sorted mating, ¿no? Si me caso con mi primo, más igual que eso no puede haber. ¿En qué medida, la pregunta sería, ¿en qué medida la sorted mating es lo mismo que casarse con primos, ¿no? Entonces me impresiona un poco el cambio que encontraron en los ingresos. Y la otra tiene que ver con el tema del movimiento gay y su reconocimiento. ¿Cómo lo podrías traducir eso al reconocimiento de temas de género? ¿Qué eventos hacen que ahora sea mucho más fácil reconocer ese problema?
Sí. Al primer punto, no me parece que verdaderamente se pueda pensar como assortative mating. Obviamente sí, al nivel genético, pero no me parece como lo entendemos en los matrimonios modernos, en el cual cuando pensamos en el assortative mating lo pensamos, por ejemplo, en temas de educación o en temas de ingresos, que también están muy ligados a educación. Y ahí eso importa. Assortative mating puede ser bueno, puede ser malo. La cuestión es que en mis papers lo que he mostrado es que eso lleva más desigualdad, por lo menos para países como Estados Unidos, para países como Inglaterra, lleva más desigualdad. Pero no pienso que el estudio que hicieron nuestros autores tiene que ver con ese tipo de assortative mating, sino que lo que está mostrando es que esa gente compartían terrenos, se quedaban uno cerca al otro, no se movían geográficamente para tomar los beneficios de la movilidad geográfica y por lo tanto de la movilidad social. Es un momento donde en Estados Unidos hay mucha movilidad geográfica, se está urbanizando y la gente que se casaba con sus primos se quedan. Tienen mucho más tendencia a quedarse. Y eso tiene partes de muchos beneficios. Te imaginas una comunidad agraria, cuando uno se casa con el otro, hay mucho más risk sharing. Tiene muchos beneficios. Donde no existe el Estado que te dé seguros sociales. Tiene muchos beneficios. Tiene gente que te cuida si cuando te pongas viejo, te cuida si te enfermas. Y justamente una cosa que muestran en el paper que es interesante es que la gente que no se casa con primos o que tienen menos tendencia a casarse con primos terminan con una más alta probabilidad de estar institucionalizados en vez de estar cuidados por su familia. Lo que pasa es que cuando una economía está modernizándose, eso puede ser bastante negativo porque necesitas la movilidad. Necesitas que la gente se mueva donde existen las oportunidades. En cuanto a lo de gays, me parece que lo de gays es distinto en cierta manera porque tiende a ser un win-win situation. Y es algo que decimos en la conclusión del paper. Si vos sos una madre o un padre que puede tener una hija o un hijo que sea gay, o sos una mujer que puede tener un hermano o un hermano que puede tener una hermana que sea gay, el hecho que la sociedad apruebe más, le dé más oportunidad a esta persona, que no haga que esta gente se esconda, es una ganancia. No solo eso, sino que ser gay no depende de tu ambiente social, no depende si sos rico, pobre, blanco, negro, grupo étnico que sos. Entonces es algo bastante general en la sociedad. Entonces la sociedad, en cierta manera, no hay perdedores. Aprobar más, ser más tolerante, aprobar de uniones gays, no está, es difícil pensar quién va a perder. Ahora, cuando vas al caso de la mujer, es menos obvio eso, porque el hombre pierde su estatus en la familia como el proveedor, el jefe, el que decide. También hay ganancias, hay mucha responsabilidad, mucha depresión, mucho sentimiento de culpa si uno no puede ser la persona que gana el pan en la vida. Entonces yo pienso que es menos claro que no hay perdedores. Pienso que mi tendencia a pensar es que todos van a ganar, pero no es tan claro. Pienso que hay cierta generación de hombres que van a perder. Imagínate la competencia para puestos económicos importantes, puestos políticos importantes. Ahora la competencia no va a ser solo entre hombres, sino entre hombres y mujeres. La situación se volvió más competitiva, tenés menos chance de ganar. Esa es una situación con perdedores. Además, estamos hablando del 50% de la población. Con gente gay estamos hablando, no sé. Las cifras, depende de qué cifras mirar, 1 a 3 a 4% de la población es una población mucho más pequeña. No cambian las chances tuyas en la vida si una persona abiertamente gay no está discriminada contra. Entonces pienso que son bastante distintos las situaciones en las cuales cambiar la cultura engendra perdedores y ganadores, y cuando uno cambia la cultura no hay perdedores verdaderos. Esa es la diferenciación que haría.
Gracias.
Buenos días, Raquel. Aquí Pablo Kotler. Tengo una pregunta. ¿Hasta qué punto la estructura familiar y la información y percepciones que se tienen al interior de ella afectan el futuro de una empresa familiar?
No conozco la investigación en este campo. Sería interesante saber, pero no lo sé.
Gracias.
Ya, perdón.
Hola Raquel, buenos días.
Buenos días.
Mi pregunta es, me gustó muchísimo lo que está platicando y la presentación estuvo muy buena. Solo quisiera saber cómo es que nos movemos adelante como sociedad manteniendo tradiciones culturales las cuales apreciamos cuando la presión del capitalismo es muy fuerte sobre nuestra vida, sobre las normas que implementamos como sociedad. Nada más quisiera saber qué opina usted sobre las políticas que se tienen que tomar en cuenta y qué podemos hacer para mover adelante y o sea, para que no nos olvide el mundo capitalista, que podemos observar que países que tal vez siguen muy atados a sus culturas antiguas, tradicionales, tal vez están un poco left behind, pero pues sí, nada más quisiera saber qué opina.
Pienso que hay una cierta homogeneización de cultura que se está dando. Simplemente, yo no sé si diría que es por el capitalismo eso, sino por los medios sociales. Es decir, la gente escucha mucho más la misma música que antes. Y sí, el capitalismo da lugar a que hay muchos más libros, supongo, publicados en inglés que en cualquier otro idioma. Y también que todos aprendan el inglés si van a aprender un idioma secundario y no el español o el francés. Entonces sí, se da una cierta homogeneización que sí se puede pelear y uno ve como un país como, por ejemplo, Francia, trata de pelear esas cosas, pero es muy difícil de pelear. Ahora, no cambiar la cultura, no estoy de acuerdo. Yo pienso que la cultura es algo que sí cambia. Y cuando no cambia es porque ha estado en un environment, en un entorno medio estático. Si verdaderamente uno está con shock, si está cambiando la economía, está cambiando la tecnología, va a cambiar la cultura. Va a cambiar. Y no lo veo como algo negativo. Entonces me parece que uno tiene que preguntarse qué aspectos de cultura uno no quisiera ver desaparecer. Para mí es muy importante el idioma. Yo no quisiera que desaparezca el francés, el español, y que todos hablen inglés. Estoy segura que debe haber logros económicos con eso. En vez de tener divisiones, todos hablan el mismo idioma, pero no me parece buena idea. Pero si no, pienso que uno tiene que preguntarse por qué uno valora un cierto aspecto cultural. Si uno sabe que en 200 años lo que hacemos ahora se va a ver como una cultura vieja. Lo que estamos haciendo en este momento se va a ver como una cultura anticuada. Si la cultura va a cambiar, no hay nada que hacerle y no lo veo en sí mismo como algo negativo. No necesariamente capitalista, menos que el capitalismo es muy dinámico. Y al ser muy dinámico introduce cambios más rápidamente que en los últimos 10.000 años.
Muchas gracias.
Ya de nada.
¿Hay más preguntas? Creo que ya no tenemos más preguntas del público, pues muchas gracias nuevamente, Raquel, por la presentación
Gracias.
y tu tiempo con nosotros y gracias a todos los presentes.
Muchas gracias y me despido entonces. Espero que la próxima vez sea en persona.
Muchas gracias.
Chao.